For 5 years, my mother told everyone in our community that I was an addict, building sympathy with a story that wasn't true. She repeated it so often that people believed every word. But this time, she made one serious mistake. While speaking in front of a crowd of 80 people, she didn't notice who was sitting quietly in the second row. It was the same chaplain who had stood by my side during my military surgery. And in that moment, a 5-year lie was about to fall apart instantly. I am 37 years old, a captain in the United States Army Aviation Branch with 13 years of service, but on a cold Sunday in late October, in a quiet church fellowship hall in Central Virginia, none of that existed. On that day, my mother stood before 80 people and told them I was a lost soul, a woman destroyed by her own choices. She wasn't wrong about me being lost, but she was lying about the geography of my disappearance. She had invented a daughter to replace the one she couldn't understand, splitting the woman I actually am away from the version she needed for her stories. To understand how we ended up in that courtroom, I have to take you back to Paktia province, eastern Afghanistan, on October 14, 2018, to the moment the world actually broke. I was the aircraft commander for a personnel recovery tasking, flying under the call sign 7 Actual. That suffix meant the controls were in my hands. It meant the lives in the back were my direct responsibility. We had 4 passengers and my door gunner, Specialist Danny Teague. Danny was only 21, a kid with a gap between his front teeth and an annoying habit of humming country tunes during pre-flight checks. We were 40 minutes into the flight when the world turned into a centrifuge. An RPG struck the tail rotor assembly, and in an instant, the physics of flight vanished. When a Black Hawk loses tail rotor authority, it doesn't just drop, it begins a violent, rightward yaw. The instinct of an untrained person is to fight the spin, but fighting it is a death sentence. You have 2 seconds to enter autorotation, manage the energy in the rotor disc, and find a piece of earth that won't kill everyone on impact. I found a dry riverbed. It was a confined area approach, executed with the kind of desperate precision that only comes when you are staring at your own end. We hit hard. Upon impact, the cyclic control stick slammed forward between my knees. My harness caught the massive load across my left side, and I heard the distinct, sickening snap of my collarbone. 3 ribs followed, shattering under the pressure. A sharp fragment of the collarbone shifted, pressing against my left lung like a nail being driven in sideways. All 4 passengers survived the crash. Danny Teague was alive too, at least initially. He was conscious when I unstrapped, rolling out of the cockpit with my left arm dangling uselessly and my chest making a wet, wheezing sound that no human body should ever make. For 90 minutes, we held a defensive perimeter in that riverbed, waiting for the quick reaction force. I held my sidearm in my right hand, my eyes scanning the ridgelines while my blood soaked into the dust. Danny was alive for most of those 90 minutes. His last words to me were a request to tell his mother in Georgia that it wasn't scary. Later, using a piece of cardboard cut from an MRE box, I wrote that letter to Patricia Teague. My right hand did the work while my left shoulder screamed, resulting in shaky, irregular letters pressed hard into the cardboard to ensure the ink took. I still keep a carbon copy of that letter in a Ziploc bag in my glove compartment. It is a reminder of a reality my mother would eventually try to erase. The recovery process began at Bagram's Roll 2 medical facility under flickering, institutional green lights that turned everyone's skin the color of old paper. I was conscious and polite, even as they assessed my shattered shoulder for surgery. I asked the chaplain on call to read Psalm 23. When he finished, I quoted the final verse back to him from memory, using the old translation my grandmother had taught me back in Georgia. He asked where I had learned it, and I told him, but I didn't give him my rank or my name. I simply told him I was the pilot. I didn't know then that I would see that man again 6 years later in a room that smelled of floor wax and desperation instead of jet fuel and blood. From Bagram, I was sent to Walter Reed Army Medical Center. The weeks there were a blur of surgeries, drainage tubes, and the grueling monotony of physical therapy. I had to relearn how to lift my arm above my shoulder. It was during this time, while I was flat on my back and cut off from the world, that my mother, Constance Prescott, began her architecture. She didn't wait for me to come home, or for me to be able to defend my own reputation. She walked into our family's parish fellowship hall and began weaving a tragedy. She told the congregation that I had been administratively discharged for substance abuse. She told them I was homeless, wandering, and broken. Her public prayers were a performance of grief designed to center herself as the long-suffering mother of a wayward daughter. It wasn't just a lie, it was a replacement. The woman who served multiple deployments and came home with scars she couldn't talk about was an embarrassment Constance couldn't process. She needed a story that explained the empty chair at holiday dinners in a way that garnered sympathy rather than questions she couldn't answer. A drug-addicted daughter was a narrative she could use. She told the story so many times she began to believe it herself. My life was packed away into plastic bins in the attic, my flight school graduation photos, my air medal citation, the pictures of my crew squinting in the harsh Afghan sun. On the living room shelves, I only existed as a child or a youth choir member. To the world that stepped through her front door, Joanna Prescott had ceased to exist at 18. My father died while I was still at Walter Reed. Constance didn't call me. I didn't find out until after the burial, when a nurse noticed my vitals spiking after I checked my email. When I finally returned home on limited duty, the lie had become permanent infrastructure. For 5 years, it was reinforced with every Sunday handshake and every whispered, "We don't talk about what she does." I was living a ghost's life, rebuilding my strength at Fort Belvoir, while my mother told the world I was a shadow. In September 2021, I missed my daughter Hannah's first day of 2nd grade because of a command readiness review I couldn't skip or explain. My neighbor sent me a video of Hannah in her pink backpack, looking toward the parking lot for a mother who wasn't there. I have watched that 7-second clip 41 times in the dark. The structural pain in my left shoulder remains a constant companion in cold weather, a dull ache that reminds me of the riverbed. I never filed for disability because doing so would mean accepting that the version of me that broke that day could never be fully mended. I lived in the silence of my service, a silence my mother eventually weaponized. 3 days before a family christening, I received a petition for a parental fitness review. Constance had filed for custody of Hannah, claiming I was an unstable, unfit parent. She included fabricated witness statements from 2 of her church friends, claiming they had seen me intoxicated at a gathering years prior. On the date they cited, I was on duty at Fort Belvoir. I had the logs and the records to prove it, but the petition wasn't about truth. It was about using my forced silence against me. She knew I couldn't talk about where I had been or what I had done. She had turned my classified life into evidence of my failure. I read those papers in a CVS parking lot, paralyzed by the precision of her attack. She was prepared to take my 8-year-old daughter, a girl who loves soccer and Saturday morning pancakes, simply to keep her story alive. I went home, fed Hannah, read her a book, and sat in the dark without sleeping. 3 days later, I walked into that church fellowship hall. The air was thick with the smell of sweet tea, Kroger sheet cake, and the practiced warmth of a congregation that believed every word my mother said. I sat in the back pew, watching Constance move through the room like an orchestral conductor. When she took the microphone, she spoke of the heavy burdens some families carry. She used my name with a practiced, soft tremor in her voice, telling the 80 people there that I was struggling and that she prayed for my recovery. The room nodded in unison, cocooned in the lie. But then, a man in the second pew turned around. He looked past the folding chairs and the nodding faces directly at me, standing in the doorway. When my mother's eyes followed his and landed on me, I didn't see shame. I saw calculation. She was checking the load-bearing walls of her narrative to see if they would hold. She didn't realize that the man in the second pew was the same chaplain who had held my hand in the green light of pogrom. 3 weeks later, we were in a county courtroom. The room was small, smelling of old paper and the stale air of a building designed to process failure. I arrived early, scanning the room for exits, left, right, center, a habit I couldn't break. My attorney, Margaret Ellis, a retired Army JAG officer, sat beside me. Across the aisle, Constance sat in her navy dress and pearls, the picture of a concerned grandmother. She didn't look at me. Then, the door opened, and the man from the church entered. He walked with the measured gait of someone who had seen the worst of the world. He wore his Roman collar and a dark coat, moving to a seat near me. He watched my hands, which were flat and still on the railing, and he watched my eyes as I continued to scan the room. He recognized the sequence. He knew exactly who I was and where I had really been. The fluorescent light overhead continued its relentless, mechanical buzz, a sound that usually fades into the background for most, but for me, it remained a constant, sharp frequency. Below that hum, the courtroom was a staging ground of small, mundane movements, the clerk sorting stacks of legal bond, my mother whispering urgently into the ear of her attorney, William Graves. They were oblivious to the shift in the room's atmosphere. Then, a voice broke through the static, quiet, steady, and directed solely at me. It spoke of Paktia Province, October 2018, and reminded me of the old translation I had quoted. I looked at the man for 3 full seconds. His face had aged since the last time I had seen it, which was from the disorienting perspective of a gurney under the sickly green glow of a military medical bay. Back then, I had a drainage tube in my chest and a surgeon's hands on my shattered collarbone, but his eyes were unmistakable. They were the patient, unwavering eyes of a man who had spent his life standing in the gap between the living and the dying. He told me he remembered the verse, and I confirmed that my grandmother in Georgia had been the one to teach it to me. He nodded once, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible, before taking his seat 2 rows behind me. That brief exchange lasted only 11 seconds, but it changed everything. My attorney, Margaret Ellis, had heard every word. She closed her file with a definitive thud and placed her hand flat on the table, exhaling a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks. She had found him in my case file while cross-referencing the Bugram chaplain against active clergy in Virginia. When she had first revealed his name to me, the coincidence had struck me dumb. Now, the hearing was officially underway. Judge Warren Howard entered, a man whose silver-templed appearance suggested he had seen enough custody battles to read the truth before a single witness was sworn in. William Graves began the opening statement for my mother. He was the picture of polished legal authority, his silver cufflinks catching the light as he spoke with a practiced, rhythmic cadence. He painted a portrait of a mother burdened by a daughter's supposed spiral into substance abuse and instability. He leaned heavily on the word pattern and the word concern, using my daughter as a rhetorical shield while carefully avoiding the word evidence. He spoke of the witness statements from Walsh and Hammond as if they were gospel, portraying me as a woman who had simply vanished into a life of failure. Margaret's response was a sharp contrast. Her opening was less than a minute long. She stated flatly that the petition was built on fabricated testimony that would be systematically dismantled by military records, proving the allegations were not just false, but physically impossible. The testimony began with Rebecca Walsh. She sat in the witness chair clutching her purse as if it were a life preserver. Margaret wasted no time, asking her to specify the date of the family gathering where she claimed to have seen me intoxicated 2 years prior. Rebecca's eyes immediately darted to my mother, seeking a cue that never came. When she faltered, Margaret produced my duty logs from Fort Belvoir and the post-access records that proved I hadn't left the installation during that entire window of time. The silence in the room grew heavy as Rebecca's hands began to tremble. Finally, she admitted quietly that Constance had told her what to write. Though Graves objected and the judge sustained it, the damage was done. The truth had entered the room, and it wasn't leaving. Carol Hammond followed, but unlike Rebecca, she remained rigid and defiant. She recited her statement almost word for word, a memorized script she refused to abandon. Margaret didn't bother arguing with her. She simply entered the same military logs into evidence and requested that the court refer the testimony for investigation under the state statutes regarding fraudulent statements in custody proceedings. The tension shifted again when it was my turn to take the stand. I sat with my hands flat on the table, maintaining the posture of a pilot. When asked my occupation, I gave my cover: aviation consulting and logistics. It was a habit of 8 years, a silence born of necessity that doesn't break just because you're under oath. William Graves approached his cross-examination with the expectation that I was the volatile, defensive woman my mother had described. He pushed me on my absences from family events, and I gave him the only answer I could: work obligations. He then pivoted to the crash in Paktia, having obtained just enough of my medical records to be dangerous. He sneered the word uncontrolled, implying that the destruction of my aircraft was the result of pilot error and recklessness. He was trying to paint a picture of a woman whose life was a series of crashes, someone unfit to raise a child. I didn't look at him when I answered. I spoke with the clinical, detached precision of an accident report. I explained the tail rotor authority failure caused by the RPG strike and noted that the auto-rotation entry was initiated within 2 seconds. I described the confined area approach into the riverbed and pointed out that all 4 passengers survived. I told him the aircraft was not set down uncontrolled, it was set down by design. Graves stopped mid-reach for his notepad, his hand hovering in the air. He had expected a paper pusher, not a combat pilot who could name her tools and her actions without a hint of hesitation or apology. The room tilted. Judge Howard removed his glasses and looked at me, then at Margaret, who seized the moment to call our surprise witness, Father Thomas Whalen. Graves objected immediately, citing a lack of notification, but Margaret argued that Father Whalen was a fact witness with direct knowledge that had only recently become available. The judge allowed it. The man in the dark coat stood and walked to the stand with that same measured, unhurried gait. He didn't look at my mother as he passed. He stated his former rank, Major in the Chaplain Corps, and his service at Bagram Airfield. I watched my mother's head snap toward him. She had known this man as her parish priest for 18 months, shaking his hand after every service, never imagining that he had been a witness to the very world she was trying to erase. Father Whalen recounted the night of October 14, 2018, in vivid, heartbreaking detail. He described the medevac flight, the casualties, and the pilot with the shattered shoulder and the bone fragment pressing against her lung. He told the court how I had held his hand and quoted the old translation of the psalm. He identified me as Sabre 7 Actual, the aircraft commander who had managed a defensive perimeter for 90 minutes while critically injured. The room went absolutely still. Even the buzzing light seemed to fade as he explained that while my mother was telling her congregation I was a homeless addict, he was the man who had initiated my transfer paperwork to Walter Reed. He produced a photocopy of the field communication log from that night, a document that listed my name, rank, injury assessment, and call sign, all time-stamped. It was the ultimate contradiction to my mother's architecture. The logs showed that during the months she claimed I was lost to the streets, I was actually fighting for my life in a military hospital. Judge Howard accepted the document, his gaze lingering on the dates before turning to my mother. Constance's handkerchief slipped from her fingers and hit the floor unnoticed. The composed, elder statesman persona she had cultivated for 5 years finally cracked. Her attorney, stunned into silence, didn't even attempt an objection. He had come to prosecute a failure, but he was standing across from a decorated commander whose truth had finally been brought into the light. The load-bearing walls Constance had spent 5 years constructing did not fall all at once. They disintegrated under the weight of a single piece of paper and the steady gaze of a man in a Roman collar. Father Whalen sat in the witness chair with his hands folded, refusing to editorialize or embellish a single detail. He simply recounted what he had seen and produced the record he had kept. That was all it took. Margaret looked at me, and I looked back at her, sharing the silent shorthand of 2 women who had worn the uniform and understood that the truth is often a quiet, heavy thing. Judge Howard removed his glasses and set them on the bench, his expression unreadable. He called for a 15-minute recess, and the room seemed to exhale a collective breath. I stayed in my seat, placing my hands flat on the table and adjusting my watch inside my left wrist, a habit from flight training at Rucker. The silver face caught the light, but I didn't look at Constance. Her burden was no longer mine to carry. During the break, Margaret leaned over and whispered 2 words, "We're done." She wasn't just talking about the petition. She was talking about the entire legal scaffolding my mother had built over 3 weeks and rehearsed for 5 years. She meant the fraudulent statements, the calculated filings, and the predatory county process that had kept me awake at 2 in the morning, reading custody statutes while my daughter slept just 12 feet away. Margaret was right. When Judge Howard returned, he didn't sit immediately. He stood behind the bench, holding the photocopy Father Whalen had provided, the field communication log from Bagram's Roll 2, dated October 14, 2018. It was a map of my survival, call sign, blood type, injury assessment, and surgical timestamps, all legible and steady in the ink after 6 years. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at William Graves. He noted that the factual basis of the petition was not merely insufficient, it was flatly contradicted by federal records. The witness statements described events that could not have occurred while I was verifiably on a military installation. Turning to Constance, he announced that the petition for parental fitness review was dismissed with prejudice. My mother remained motionless. Then, the judge went further, referring the affidavits of Walsh and Hammond to the county prosecutor's office for review under the Virginia Code regarding fraudulent statements in a legal proceeding. He noted that Carol Hammond's refusal to recant under oath only compounded the court's concern. Then he looked at me and said, "Captain Prescott." The title landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. No one in that courtroom had called me that before. They had only known the version of me my mother had invented. He had read the truth on the communication log, and he chose to use it now in front of everyone. He told me that my daughter's custody was not, and had never been, in legal jeopardy. The matter was closed. I thanked him with 3 simple words, my hands remaining flat and still. As the hearing ended and the room began to clear, Father Whalen passed my seat. He didn't speak, but he placed his hand on the railing near mine for 1 second. It was the gesture of a man who understood that some debts are settled in silence. The hallway outside was filled with the same stale, recirculated air. Margaret and I were walking toward the exit when I heard the frantic click of heels on the tile, the sound of a woman who had never had to chase anyone and didn't know how to do it with grace. My mother stopped 6 feet away, her pearl brooch still pinned to her dress, but her handkerchief was gone, likely left on the courtroom floor where she had dropped it. Her eyes were wet with the shock of exposure, the look of someone whose protective wall had been suddenly torn down. She tried to claim I never told her what I was, her voice breaking before she could finish. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told her that she had built a story while I was in a hospital, risking my daughter's future to protect a lie she had invented. I told her that she never asked about my life, not once in 13 years. I said it with the clinical accuracy of a clearance readback. Confirmed. Closed. I walked out of the courthouse and into the cold, dry air of an early November afternoon. The truth doesn't need to be loud. It only needs one good witness. The weeks that followed were a study in how a life collapses in the real world, not with a bang, but through a series of closing doors and unreturned calls. William Graves withdrew as my mother's attorney within a week, citing irreconcilable differences to protect his own reputation from the fraud referral. Rebecca Walsh recanted her statement fully, admitting in the court record that Constance had told her what to write and even provided the pre-formatted language. Carol Hammond, however, dug in, maintaining her lie with a rigid loyalty that would likely cost her more in legal fees than the friendship was worth. Within the church, the collapse was just as thorough. Father Whalen didn't need to preach about it. The public record of the court proceedings did the work for him. The story of the helicopter pilot and the mother who filed false documents while her daughter was at Walter Reed circulated until the facts outweighed 5 years of performance. Constance resigned from her position at the parish 3 weeks later, citing personal health. No one organized a prayer circle for her. No one reached for her hand. The sympathy she had farmed for years had been load-tested against a single timestamped document, and it had failed. I didn't follow the progress of the fraud charges. I didn't need to. Hannah was with me, and the record was corrected. One afternoon, I drove south toward Fort Belvoir as the light turned the color of old brass. I pulled into a rest stop and sat in the silence, my left shoulder aching in the cold. I opened the glove compartment and took out the Ziploc bag containing that piece of MRE cardboard. I looked at my unsteady handwriting, the letters pressed hard into the material so the ink would take. I read the words I wrote to Danny Teague's mother, telling her that her son wasn't scared at the end. That letter has traveled with me for 6 years, from hospital beds to duty stations, and it will stay with me until I stop. I refolded the cardboard and sat for a minute longer, thinking about Saturday morning pancakes and an 8-year-old girl who would never have to wonder where her mother was. I am in the promotion zone for major again, and while I was passed over once due to the gap in my evaluations during recovery, I know things move at their own speed. Tomorrow morning at 0530, I will be back on the flight roster. The professional world, the only world that has ever truly known me, is waiting. There is a carbon copy of a letter with shaky handwriting and a daughter who is safe. That is enough. I work at a post in Virginia now, without the need for church bulletins or public announcements. I am just Joanna. Take care. Thank you.